All right, we are back here. We're talking on the podcast Holiday Special, talking about the book The Captain, written about New York Mets star Basin David Wright. Speaking to one of the authors of the book right now, the team's beat reporter for MLB.com, Anthony DiComo, was on the line. Anthony, welcome, and how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing pretty good. I admit, as a guy who's read this book a couple times, I think it's very, very interesting to get a look at David Wright like the one you gave us.
I appreciate that. Yeah, he's it's for anyone, for any Mets fan of a certain age or of any age, really. I think he's a guy who you either grew up looking up to, or you respected as someone that played the game the right way, that did things the right way, and it was it was a pleasure to kind of be able to tell that story as someone who covered him, because there are very few better guys in the game.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And obviously, I know you mentioned a bit in the book that like you met him in 2007 when you were working as an intern with Marty Noble, talking about how great he was. So what was your relationship like with David Wright as a player for the team?
Well, David was always kind of, the go-to guy in the clubhouse. And you can say that about a lot of star players around the league, just by definition of being a star. They're the guys that reporters go to. They're the guys that are expected to speak after every game. But David kind of took to that role in a way that a lot of guys don't. And that's not to say that he, favored the spotlight, favored being in front of the camera. If anything, he was kind of the opposite. But, he understood more than probably any player I've ever seen the responsibilities that come part and parcel with being a star in New York. And he very much was a star. He came up here with high expectations. He fulfilled those expectations. He exceeded those expectations. So my experience with David, when I met him in 2007, he was already that. He had already had a couple of big seasons. He was a star in New York. He was the Mets answer to Derek Jeter. And I expected kind of that stereotypical superstar persona. And he wasn't that. He was a very down-to-earth guy. He was the type of guy that, yes, he had to jockey for time to talk to him because everyone else in the media wanted to talk to him. But, he was willing to engage with you and to be honest with you. And those are really important qualities for a player, from the media's perspective. So, it was always a pleasurable interaction with David. And then over the years, as years passed and reporters come, reporters go. And, I was kind of one of the constants on the beat. So we developed, a tighter relationship through that. And that's kind of how, in the end, the book came about.
Yeah, how did the idea for the book first come up? And like, when was this idea that you and David came together and say, we're going to write a book about your career?
This was an idea that I had in the back of my head for a long time. Like I said, having covered him for a decade plus, having seen, just how much he meant to this fan base, to the city of New York, baseball in New York, and B, seeing some of the trials and tribulations that he went through. It was in the back of my mind that this would make a good subject for a book, a good topic for a book. I didn't know what form it would take or if it would ever happen. But once he kind of went through the last phase of his career and came back for that one final game, and it was so, for anyone who remembers that time, it was just such a dramatic thing. And that's what it really crystallized in my mind. Like, this is definitely, a book topic. This is a subject I want to do it. So I approached David at the very end of his final season and kind of told him what was on my mind. And in my mind, I kind of thought it would be a biography. As I mentioned, David's not the type of person who seeks out the spotlight. And I didn't think he would want to necessarily write a memoir, a first-person autobiography, but he was flattered that I was interested in doing anything at all. And we got to talking a little bit after the season. And the more we talked, the more I think he kind of gained a little interest in this idea of writing his own story, of having something, putting down while it was fresh in his mind, everything that he did in his career, something to show his kids one day when they're old enough to really understand it. So the more we got to talking, the more it kind of gelled into this form of the autobiography, the memoir, and then we got to work.
Yeah, so what was it like working with David on the book? Because I'm sure it probably was a lot of interview sessions, sitting down, talking about all these different aspects of his career.
it was a ton of interview sessions. And the one thing I always say is that David was, exactly what I expected. If he said, "I'll call you at 2:00," he called you at 2:00. I mean, that's just the kind of guy that he is, which made the process easy. One of the things that I was concerned about going into the process was it's one thing to do what I do in my day job and write articles and, write about the Mets, write about players, write about various things, but to write in someone else's voice, in their eyes, I had to not only, make it sound good, but also make it sound authentic, make it sound like David, make it sound so that somebody reading the book who knows David and has heard him talk and has heard him, do his various interviews over the years, reads it and says, yes, this is him. This is what he sounds like. So that was a challenge that I always had in the back of my mind. But David, he's a relatively eloquent guy to begin with, so that made it easier. And just his accessibility and his willingness to be open and honest. The other obstacle that was in my mind going into this was David's a guy with kind of a squeaky clean image. There are no skeletons in the closet. So how do you kind of make a book interesting and dramatic when it is that way? But I think two things stood out in that regard. One was there was so much built-in drama with David's career, just with everything that he put his body through with the injuries and everything that he did to make this something special. I think people will read the book and realize there was a lot more depth to it than maybe they saw on the surface, and that he went through a lot more than maybe they realized at the time. So it was a fun process. It was a lot of hard work, but I think we both enjoyed it.
Yeah, I saw you did over 40 interviews of people getting ready for this book, giving some context. It's like, who were the people you talked to apart from David that sort of had the most interesting insights to you?
There were a few, a couple that stand out. I as I mentioned, I covered the bulk of David's career, over a decade plus. Everything that fans saw, whether that was the big moments in 2006 or the collapse in 2007-08, the playoff run in 2015. I was there, so maybe I didn't have David's inside perspective on those things at the time, but I saw them with my own two eyes. I talked to David and other players at the time, so I knew what was going on. What I didn't see with my own two eyes was his upbringing, was how he kind of developed into a star. So the interviews that I found most interesting were with his parents. He had a couple of particularly influential coaches early in his life when he was on the AAU travel circuit down in Virginia. Part of a class of young players that included Ryan Zimmerman and the Upton brothers and Michael Kadire and all these guys who went on to be first-round draft picks in the majors. You'll read the book and you'll realize that wasn't necessarily coincidence, that there were some really influential forces down there that were helping these players develop. So a lot of those interviews, really were probably the most educational for me, and I leaned the most heavily on, as opposed to, later in his career leaning more on, my own experiences and research aspects of it, because, you can look up pretty easily what David did in the World Baseball Classic in 2013. You can't look up what he did in some 12 and under AAU game back in the 90s. So it was, those to me were the chapters also that kind of built his character and showed you what this guy's all about.
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting parts of the book, in the beginning especially, is like just seeing the relationship that Wright had with his father, Ron. And then you sort of see that carries throughout his career, the influence Ron had. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, Ron Wright was, if you describe, I've described David as the guy who does everything the right way, and there are no skeletons. I mean, that's very much from his parents, and it's, a big and specific portion of it comes from his dad, who was, police officer for many years, worked his way all the way up to the assistant chief of police in Norfolk, Virginia, which, had a lot of crime back in the day. And, it's funny, and I actually told this story to David, and he laughed, because I interviewed Ron and his wife at their home in Virginia. This was right when I was at the beginning of the process. And then a few months later, I called Ron just to follow up on a couple things, flesh out a couple more details. And we wound up talking for well over an hour, and it was fascinating stuff. And he was telling me about his days on the force and drug busts that they did and things that were, looking back, were very dangerous police work. And he didn't even necessarily realize it at the time, or maybe blocked it out in his mind at the time. But this was really important and heavy stuff that he was doing. And as a result, he was a strict guy. He saw a lot of the ills in the world, and he wanted to make sure that his sons did not go down any of those paths. So there was no wiggle room in a lot of, the things that David could do growing up. He grew up in a very strict upbringing, and as a result, I think that's a big portion why he was able to succeed, because he will be the first to tell you that David Wright was never the biggest, the fastest, the strongest. He had doubts coming all the way up along along the ladder, even as a first round draft pick, wondering if he belonged, seeing guys like Jose Reyes who were so athletically gifted and talented and feeling like he didn't belong. But that strictness that he grew up with and that attention to detail and all that, the value of hard work, the blue collar mentality that David found so valuable, those are the things that he used to kind of work himself into being on par with those super talented first round prospects.
Yeah, is there one favorite nugget you found in the research of the story that you were doing? Because for me, I think one of the things that made me laugh when I read it was the part where he goes to rookie ball and he has a 4:00 workout. He showed up at 3:50 thinking, oh, I'm 10 minutes early, I'm good. And then all the guys are chewing him out saying, hey, you got to be more dedication. Stuff like that's cool to find. That's stuff you don't always just hear about in the around the rounds of the internet.
Yeah, I tried to sprinkle some fun little things like that in. As another example, very early in his career, the first couple of weeks of his career, the Mets took a road trip to Montreal, and he showed up to the ballpark wearing flip-flops, which, to you or I might seem like, okay, whatever, but that's a breach of MLB code, of clubhouse etiquette. You don't do that. You dress nicely when you come to and from the clubhouse on the road. So things like that, stories about, going to a Montreal karaoke bar with, Mike Piazza and other veterans on the team. Lots of funny stuff. I think one of the things in that regard that surprised me, and kudos to David for keeping this under wraps, because I didn't really know about it all that much when I was, when David was an active player, and I had never heard it really reported elsewhere, but he's kind of a legendary prankster and did a lot of things to a lot of people over the years. And David will be the first to say he's one of those guys that if he messes with you, that's how you know that he likes you. It's like his way of showing love is to go and take all the tires off your car and hide them around a baseball stadium. Like, that's his way of saying I love you. So there's lots of we devoted a little section of some of his better pranks over the years, and he's got some targets in the Mets organization that he hit up quite a few times. But yeah, I was surprised. I didn't realize how prolific he was at the prank game.
Yeah, that was definitely a lot of fun. One of my favorite parts of the book. I also like seeing the relationships he has with some of his teammates. And obviously the one that stuck out to me the most was when he first got up his relationship with Joe McEwing, the utility infielder of the Mets at the time, and he took him under his wing, and how he wanted to sort of follow McEwing's example. He was shocked when the Mets cut McEwing the following spring. So you talk a little bit about that relationship.
Yeah, it was almost in a sense like a father-son relationship. Joe McEwing he was not the talent that David was, but he was very much the same personality that David was, in that he made the most of his physical gifts. He worked 3 times as hard as the next person because that was the only way he was going to make it. And David, from a very young age, identified that and related to it. And, Joe, I think in turn did the same and took him under his wing. And, David's first season in New York, those two were absolutely inseparable. I mean, David would go over weekends and have dinner with Joe McEwing and his wife. I remember distinctly going and we were, the Mets were in Chicago playing the White Sox I guess this was the 2019 trade deadline. And I, blocked out some time and got in contact with Joe McEwing, who's the White Sox coach, and said, can I talk to you about David? And he replied, David's my guy, anything for my guy. And, we had a great conversation, and Joe was almost tearing up at points talking about David. That's how much they cared about each other. So when the following spring, when Joe McEwing was released from the Mets, for those who follow the team or cover the team, I think it wasn't a huge surprise. This was a guy who wasn't necessarily a roster fit anymore for a team that was really starting to get competitive and sign, super uber all-stars like Carlos Beltran and Carlos Delgado. There wasn't really a place for Joe McEwing anymore, but in David's eyes, it was like, this is my guy. How could the Mets possibly get rid of the guy? How could anything bad happen to, someone that I'm close with? And I think on some level as a player, you're always aware that, you hear all the time the cliche of, well, baseball's a business, and players get that. But until it affects them personally, you don't really realize what that means. And Joe McEwing getting cut was the first time that David really got that shock of, oh, this really is a cold-blooded business, and it doesn't matter how good a guy you are. If you don't fit in the team's plans, you might not be there. So that one hurt. And was kind of a prelude to other ones along the way, whether that was Jose Reyes, not being re-signed, or Willie Randolph getting fired. I mean, guys that meant a lot to David in his career didn't stick around for the whole thing. And I think every time it's a little bit of a shock when something like that happens.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it was also interesting seeing David go through the three of the more memorable years of his career, 2006, 07, 08, 06. He admits, oh, I thought I was going to be here every year. Then he sort of differentiates between the differences of the collapses of 07, 08. So 07 was a collapse. 08 was sort of just didn't have enough bullets in the tank. Like, what was it like going through those 3 years with him?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And I think people, myself included, tend to lump 2007 and 2008 together as Mets collapses. Even though 08 wasn't necessarily as big as 7 games up with 17 to go, it was still, one the Mets more or less had in the bag and weren't able to finish. But David looked at it very much differently. And that did surprise me a little bit. He looked at 2007 as this was a World Series caliber team. This was, as talented as any team the Mets have had, certainly this century. And they just flat out couldn't get it done. And they pressed and they, failed, plain and simple. 2008 was much more, in David's eyes, it was much more a team running on fumes, a team that had major injury issues, and then other teams coming up, like the Brewers, for example, and CC Sabathia pitching out of his mind down the stretch that year to bring the Brewers to the playoffs. That wasn't one that he looks back at and says, oh, if only we had done this differently, if only we had done this differently, things could have changed. 2007, much different. 2007 was the one he regrets. That was, a world-class team that just for whatever reason, and he still can't quite explain it today, for whatever reason, couldn't get it done.
Yeah, and obviously that stuff is memorable for him. I feel like also like the middle part of his career from like 2009 to about 2013 kind of gets forgotten about in all the David Wright stuff because you had the early success, the collapses, and the spinal stenosis stuff. But I think that's sort of the more interesting parts of the book, including I thought this caught my attention was when he was talking about when Citi Field opened in 2009, he hit only 10 home runs the first year, and he said that got in his head, and he spent the whole offseason trying to bulk up, and he realized, yeah, I hit more homers, my average went down. Can you talk a little bit about that, about like how he sort of admits, like, hey, like I was trying too hard to just be a homer guy?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's one of the more general regrets that he's had in his career is how he let Citi Field get into his head. Because David was never thought of himself as a home run hitter, and he had such a great swing, and he used the right side, right center field so well as a right-handed hitter. And that was his power alley, and a ton of doubles. You get some triples out of that. And yes, the balls went over the wall, and he had a couple of 30 homer seasons there early in his career, and got a little homer happy. And then when Citi Field opened, and it was just death on right-handed hitters, on all hitters, but especially on right-handed hitters, he did let that get into his head. In his mind, the way to combat that was to bulk up, to get as strong as he possibly could, and to try and hit balls 500 feet over the wall. And it just wasn't possible. Looking back, I think he would have done two things differently. One, he would have said, I don't need to hit home runs to help this team. I can use these gigantic gaps in Citi Field to become a better pure hitter, to become a doubles gap guy who can hit well over 300 with decent power, but not necessarily with 25, 30 home runs a year. And the other part of that is looking back now, and this part isn't necessarily David's fault, but the thinking at the time was still very much, to hit home runs, you need to get big. And it wasn't about what we see today in terms of even power hitters trying to improve their flexibility, their pliability, thinking about mechanics and launch angle and things like that realistically have a bigger impact on power hitting than just being as big and strong as humanly possible. This was still very much the chicks dig the long ball kind of bulking up mentality, and David fell victim to it a little bit and, hurt himself a little bit. And to his credit, was able to get out of it and still had some fine years after that, some all-star years after that, until the injuries really started to get in the way in 2015 and later. But it was a struggle. It was a battle, and Citi Field was definitely something that David had to overcome.
Yeah, I'll touch on the injuries in a second. But one thing I want to get to real quick, obviously, the contract negotiations. He talks about when he got the chance to sign the extension in 2012 and how he made it clear, like, I never wanted to leave. I know there were rumors out there saying, maybe he'll hit the market, maybe he'll just get out because the situation wasn't going well. It was cool to get the insight of his conversation with Sandy Alderson, because he mentioned at the press conference, Sandy has this plan. He basically said Sandy laid the plan out for me. He told me about Jacob deGrom, who was not a heralded guy at the time, all the pitching arms we had, his plan to add in guys like Curtis Granderson. I thought it was pretty cool, but like Sandy had that vision, and that was what sold David Wright on staying.
Well, what's interesting too is, David was the New York Mets. He obviously had a great relationship with ownership, with the Wilpons. He was the guy that the Mets wanted to build around, and in some corner of his brain, he knew that, of course. But there was also this idea that, okay, Sandy Alderson's coming in here. I know about Sandy Alderson's reputation as a legendary general manager, but I don't know Sandy Alderson, and Sandy Alderson doesn't know me. And as much as I want to be a Met for life, this guy might be coming in here with orders to trim payroll and orders to do this, do that, and it just might not be possible. So there was an intimidation factor there of kind of that I think that anyone has when they have a new boss that they don't know coming in, and you're trying to establish this relationship and you're worried about your own future. And then Sandy Alderson shows up that winter in Virginia to play a round of golf with David, and it was just the most natural relationship on earth. And that day really, as you'll read in the book, that day really put David's mind at ease. So that was such an important thing for David. And if you ask him about his, what he's most proud of his career, he'll tell you, realistically, he'll tell you three things. He'll tell you, making the World Series was such a goal and something that he was so proud to do. Becoming the Mets captain was probably the biggest honor he ever had. And spending his entire career with one team, with the Mets, was that important to him. So the fact that Sandy Alderson allowed him to do that was huge for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, the big thing that changed Wright's career is the spinal stenosis diagnosed in 2015. And obviously, we saw bits of this going on. We heard, rehab, all these exercises. Dave really goes into the full routine with the dead bugs and all of these stretches he had to do before games. The amount of work he had to do just to get ready for one baseball game was just truly remarkable. And knowing that he was having to get to the road parks 11 a.m. to be ready in time for like a 5 o'clock game was insane.
Yeah, and that's something that I, really pressed him on when we were doing the reporting, is like, actually tell me really what you were going through, because I'm like you. I thought I reported on it at the time, but I don't think, and I knew at the time that I didn't know, like how much I didn't know, but I didn't know what David was really going through on a day-to-day basis, because he's not the kind of guy who's going to complain. He's not the kind of guy who's going to say, oh, woe is me, I'm doing 2-a-day physical therapy sessions and this and that, and my back hurts every single day. He's just never going to go there. So it was eye-opening to me to see really, truly what he was going through and how much he was putting in. Flying out there to LA, really with an open-ended plane ticket, having no idea when or if he would ever make it back. Staying at a hotel, staying at an Airbnb, getting kicked out because a wedding block was coming in, trying to find some place that would take a reservation that, with no end date. It was an interesting time. And given the nature of his injury, a degenerative back condition, I think a lot of players would have said, you know what? Okay, I tried. I'm good. And he never had that mindset. His mindset was always very much the opposite, that I never want to have a single regret in terms of I've reached the end of my career and I look back and I could have done more work, or I could have done something differently, or I could have, gone a tiny bit further just in the hopes of maybe making it back or making the playoffs again or helping in any little way. He wanted to do everything possible and overturn every single stone. And that's what you see in those final chapters. And I've been told they can be a little a little painful to read, which is kind of what I was going for, but I totally understand it from a Mets fan's perspective because it was a lot that he put himself through.
Yeah, it was definitely very painful. So my last question, because obviously we saw the end coming, and he admits in year 17, 18, like it was just so much painful for him to even times just get in the car and go for a drive, let alone you're going to go on the baseball field. We see the decision started leading up to, we're going to have this one last game so I can play in front of my daughters one time. And can you talk a little bit about the end here with David Wright? Because I admit, like, as somebody who was at that game on David Wright night at Citi Field, that was such a magical moment. I feel like not many players in New York get that kind of opportunity that David did to go out like that.
Yeah, and that was, I think it took a mental leap for David to finally get to the point where his mind caught up to his body and saying, okay, I'm done. Because his body was there first, and he was done, but David didn't want to admit it to himself. And then, he finally did. He had a one last gasp minor league rehab assignment, realized he couldn't do it, and then, his final request for the Mets was, I've done all this work. I've gotten my body into the shape where I can kind of go out to the field. Like, I don't want to lose this moment. I want to at least have one last try at going out there and saying goodbye, essentially. And that's what that final game was about saying goodbye. So it was important to David. It was something that the Mets were obviously willing to do for a player who meant as much to the franchise as probably anyone else who's ever played in Queens. So it was, like you said, you were there. It's almost hard to describe in terms of the emotions of that night, the drama of that night. It certainly, as someone who's covered the Mets for 13, 14 years now, it sticks out to me, unlike pretty much any other night I've covered. So imagine what it meant to David, because it was all about him, and a guy who never wanted things to be all about him kind of let his guard down for one night and took it in and allowed people to make it about him. And that's so against his nature, but he did it anyway. And as a result, he has this amazing memory that, quite frankly, almost no one ever gets. Very few players get to go out on their own terms in any way. And David wouldn't tell you that he went out on his own terms, but given the circumstances, in that small way he did. He was able to have a little bit of closure to his career, have a little bit of closure to the injury situation, say goodbye to a fan base that meant so much to him. Those were all things that happened on that final night, and that's what made it so special.
It definitely was very special. The book itself, very special. The Captain, written by our guest today, Anthony DiComo. Anthony, thanks for all the time today. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, I'll be following on social media and get themselves a copy of The Captain.
Yeah, there's a link on my Twitter at Anthony DiComo, DiComo, or you can buy The Captain with David Wright at basically anywhere books are sold. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I always encourage people to go check out their local bookstores, which should have copies as well. So check it out. I appreciate it, and hopefully it does justice to what really was an inspiring career.
It really does. I read the book. I really enjoyed it. I recommend it to all the listeners out here. Anthony, thanks for all the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, and there you have it. That was Anthony DiComo, the author of The Captain, the David Wright memoir. I highly recommend reading the book. I'll put a link to the book in the show notes as well, so you can check that out. And if you're a Met fan, it's a good read. If you're a New York baseball fan, it's a good read. Make sure you check out that book. Up next, we're going to go to the clip show part of this. We're going to take a trip down memory lane for the year of 2020 in the podcast. We're going to be joined by our unofficial co-host, Will Schneiderhan, right after this.